The fog over the Ohio backwoods was thick enough to swallow the headlights, turning the world into a series of ghostly, desaturated grays. Inside the SUV, the silence was just as heavy. Thera gripped the steering wheel, her knuckles white, while Lowell stared out the window, the blue light of a dead tablet reflecting in his eyes that were a hauntingly familiar shade of slate. They were discussing the letter in her purse, the one that threatened to split their fractured family apart, when the sky decided to rip open. It wasn't a sound at first. It was a pressure that vibrated in the marrow of their bones. Then came the shriek, a mechanical, high-pitched wail that belonged to a different era of aviation. A silver streak, jagged and burning, tore through the canopy of ancient oaks. Thera slammed on the brakes, the car skidding to a halt just as a 1962 Lockheed Starfighter obliterated a row of maples and pancaked into the shallow creek bed 50 yards ahead. The impact sent a wall of water and mud over their windshield. For a heartbeat, the world went tomb quiet, save for the ticking of cooling metal and the hiss of steam. "Stay here," Thera commanded, her voice cracking. But Lowell was already out the door, drawn by a child's terrifying curiosity. Thera ran toward the wreckage. The jet was a relic, its polished aluminum skin scorched and peeling, bearing markings that hadn't been seen in active service for decades. The cockpit canopy was cracked, clouded with smoke. Thera grabbed a heavy stone from the bank and smashed at the glass, her breath coming in ragged gasps. When the seal finally gave way, a man slumped forward. He looked as though he had stepped out of a grainy black and white reel. He wore a heavy olive flight jacket, its leather cracked with age, and a pressure suit that looked like a prop from a mid-century sci-fi flick. Thera grabbed him by the harness, dragging his dead weight away from the fuel-soaked mud just as the engine compartment erupted in a low, hungry growl of fire. As they collapsed onto the wet grass, the man groaned, his eyes fluttering open. They were wide, searching, and filled with a quiet devastation as he took in the modern SUV and the flashing LED light on Thera's phone. "Thera," he whispered, his voice a raspy echo of a dream. Thera froze. Her hand went instinctively to the man's neck, searching for a pulse, but her fingers brushed his dog tags instead. She pulled the cold metal into the light of the burning jet. Her heart stopped. The name stamped into the steel was Eamon Caldwell. The serial number was identical to the set she had kept in a velvet-lined drawer for 30 years, the ones belonging to the husband who had vanished into a cloud bank in 1962 and never came home. She looked from the metal to the face of the man who hadn't aged a single day, and then back at her son, Lowell, who stood in the shadows, looking at his own reflection in the stranger's eyes. The sirens began to wail in the distance, blue and white lights cutting through the mist, but the only world that mattered had just been reduced to ashes and impossible reunions. The antiseptic bite of the air was the first thing that anchored Eamon back to reality, but it was a reality that felt fundamentally broken. He lay on a bed that moved with the hum of a hidden motor, surrounded by walls of a white so sterile it made his eyes ache. His body felt heavy, his limbs leaden with the aftereffects of the crash, but his mind was racing back to the cockpit, to the rift, to the face of the woman in the woods who looked like his wife but wore the eyes of a stranger. A nurse entered, her uniform made of a strange, soft fabric he didn't recognize. She wasn't carrying a clipboard. She was holding a small, glowing slab of glass that fit in the palm of her hand. She tapped it, and the surface rippled with light, displaying data at a speed that made Eamon's stomach turn. "Where am I?" Eamon rasped, his voice sounding like dry parchment. "What base is this?" "You're in Bradford Memorial, honey," the nurse said, not looking up from the glowing brick. "You had quite a spill. The police are outside." "Police?" Eamon pushed himself up, the heart monitor beside him erupting into a frantic, rhythmic chirping. "I need to speak to Sheriff Simmons. Tell him Eamon Caldwell is here. He'll know the protocols. We have to report the atmospheric anomaly before the Soviets pick it up on radar." The nurse finally looked up, her expression a mix of pity and confusion. "The Soviets? Sir, I think you've got a bit of a concussion. There aren't any Soviets anymore. The Cold War ended a long time ago." Eamon's breath hitched. He looked past her toward the bedside table where another patient's device lay. A woman on the small screen was laughing, her image clearer than any cinema reel he'd ever seen, broadcast onto a device thinner than a deck of cards. The world was too bright, too fast, and the lack of a clear enemy felt like a void opening up beneath him. If the war was over, what happened to the mission? What happened to the world he was supposed to protect? Simmons, Eamon demanded, his voice rising with a desperate authority. Get me the sheriff. Now. He swung his legs over the side of the bed, his olive trousers and flight jacket, his armor, sitting on a chair nearby. He reached for them, but the door burst open. 2 orderlies in scrubs rushed in, followed by a man in a lab coat. He's agitated, the nurse said. He's talking about the USSR. I'm a major in the United States Air Force. Eamon roared, struggling as the orderlies grabbed his arms. Their grip was firm, modern, and indifferent to his rank. You have no authority to hold me. Easy, Major, the doctor said, holding a syringe aloft. Eamon fought, his heart hammering a frantic SOS against his ribs, but the needle found its mark. As the cold chemical rushed through his veins, the glowing bricks and the terrifying, peaceful future began to blur. His last thought before the darkness took him was of Thera, not the woman in the woods, but the girl who had waved him goodbye on a tarmac that had likely turned to dust decades ago. Thera sat at her kitchen table, the air in the house feeling thick and suffocating. Outside, the night was a bruised purple, but inside, the light of a single desk lamp pooled over the velvet-lined drawer she hadn't opened in years. Her hands trembled as she pulled out a weathered leather envelope. Inside was a black and white photograph, the edges silvered with age. The man in the photo leaned against the wing of a starfighter, a confident, lopsided grin splitting his handsome face. He wore the same heavy olive flight jacket she had seen draped over the hospital chair, the same one she had felt beneath her hands in the mud. He was frozen in 1962, a young major with the world at his feet. She looked at his eyes in the picture and then remembered the eyes of the man in the hospital bed. They weren't just similar, they were a perfect molecular match. The fingerprint of fate was undeniable. Eamon hadn't just come back. He had arrived exactly as he was the day the sky swallowed him whole. A mile away, the crash site had been transformed. The local fire crews and police had been unceremoniously pushed back beyond a perimeter of black SUVs. Floodlights, harsh and clinical, carved through the mist, illuminating the scorched earth where the silver jet lay like a dead guard. Agent Vance stepped out of a vehicle, his movements as precise and cold as a scalpel. He didn't look at the wreckage with wonder. He looked at it as a problem to be solved. He adjusted a pair of wire-rimmed glasses that reflected the blue-white glare of the site. I want a total blackout, Vance said, his voice a low, emotionless rasp. No cell signals, no civilian witnesses, and no local press. If it didn't happen in a textbook, it didn't happen here. His second-in-command, a woman with a tablet glowing in the dark, stepped forward. The pilot is at Bradford Memorial, sir. The locals are calling him a John Doe, but he's claiming to be military. He's not a John Doe, Vance replied, watching a technician scan the fuselage with a Geiger counter that began to chirp in frantic, uneven bursts. He's a ghost that forgot to stay dead. Secure the hospital. I want him moved to sub-level 4 before the sun comes up. We don't just have a crash, we have a breach. Thera clutched the photo to her chest, the sharp corner of the paper digging into her skin. She looked over at Lowell, who was fast asleep on the sofa, his face a soft, innocent mirror of the man in the photograph. The world was changing outside their door, turning into a place of black cars and cold operatives, and she realized with a jolt of terror that the husband she had finally learned to live without was now the most dangerous secret in the country. The sedation wore off in waves, leaving a bitter, chemical metallic taste on Eamon's tongue. He lay perfectly still, eyes closed, letting his senses map the room. He heard the electronic hum of a nearby workstation and the rhythmic, synthetic chirping of a monitor, sounds that were entirely alien to a man used to the mechanical ticking of a cockpit. Through the haze, his 1960s survival training took over. He wasn't a patient, he was a downed pilot in hostile territory. When the orderly entered to check the 4, Eamon moved with the sudden, explosive grace of a coiled spring. He bypassed the man's guard, utilizing a swift disarming maneuver taught at the academy, and rendered the orderly unconscious with a precise strike to the carotid. His hands were steady as he stripped off the hospital gown and pulled on his flight jacket. The leather felt like armor, a familiar weight in a world that had lost its gravity. Eamon slipped into the hallway, his boots silent on the linoleum. He reached the main entrance and stopped dead. The doors were solid glass, yet they slid open by themselves as he approached, retracting into the walls with a soft hiss. He flinched, expecting an ambush, but there was only the cold night air and a parking lot filled with machines that looked like polished river stones. They were bulbous, aerodynamic, and lacked the chrome-heavy aggression of the sedans he knew. Across the lot, a sleek, black motorcycle sat under a street lamp. It was a Triumph, a name he recognized, though its design was dangerously sharp. He hot-wired the ignition with a practiced twist of wires, the engine roaring to life with a high-pitched, angry snarl. As he kicked the bike into gear, the hospital security lights surged into a blinding blue-white strobe. A black SUV with tinted windows, one of Vance's Interceptors, screamed around the corner, its tires smoking. Eamon didn't hesitate. He leaned the bike low, the foot pegs scraping the asphalt as he tore toward the exit. The chase led him onto the interstate, a sprawling river of light that made him gasp. Thousands of cars moved in a synchronized high-speed dance, their red taillights stretching into infinity like a neon artery. The SUV was gaining, its headlights an aggressive glare in his rearview mirror. Eamon wove through the traffic, his heart hammering against his ribs. He felt like a ghost haunting a future that had no speed limits. He took a sharp off-ramp, leaning so far the world tilted on its axis. He didn't know where he was going, only that he had to find the forest clearing. He had to find the woman with his son's face. He disappeared into the dark of a service road, the roar of the motorcycle drowning out the sirens of a century he was never meant to inhabit. The neon sign of the roadside gas station hummed with a frantic electric buzz, casting a sickly yellow glow over the wet pavement. Thera sat in the SUV, her hands still trembling on the steering wheel, while Lowell watched the road with the quiet intensity of a lookout. They had been driving aimlessly, fueled by a mixture of shock and the desperate need to find him before the men in the black SUVs did. Then, the roar of a high-tuned engine cut through the night. A motorcycle skidded into the lot, tires smoking as it came to a jarring halt near the pumps. Eamon climbed off, his olive flight jacket dark with rain, his eyes darting toward the surveillance cameras with a pilot's suspicion of being tracked. Eamon. Thera's voice was a jagged whisper as she threw the car door open. He turned, his face softening only when he saw her. He looked exhausted, the weight of 2 different centuries pulling at his shoulders. Lowell climbed out of the back seat, moving toward the man with a strange, fearless curiosity. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a crinkled, bright blue wrapper. "You look like you're starving," Lowell said, handing him the bar. "It's chocolate. My favorite." Eamon took the object as if it were unexploded ordnance. He turned it over in his hands, squinting at the glossy, synthetic packaging and the complex nutritional grid. "What is this?" "Plastic." He tore it open, the scent of processed sugar hitting him like a physical blow. He took a bite, his brow furrowing at the unfamiliar richness. "It's efficient," he muttered, the ghost of a smile touching his lips. He turned toward the glass booth of the station, reaching into the pocket of his flight trousers. He pulled out a heavy, tarnished coin and pressed it into the metal revolving tray. "For the fuel and the bike," he told the clerk, his voice carrying the calm authority of an officer. The clerk, a teenager with glowing earbuds, stared at the coin, a 1962 Franklin $half, its silver gleaming under the fluorescent lights. Man, I can't take this," the kid drawled. "Is this like a collector thing? I need a card or Apple Pay." Eamon froze, his hand still resting on the glass. "It's legal tender. United States silver." "Eamon, stop," Thera intervened, stepping between them. She tapped her phone against the terminal, the digital ping signaling a transaction Eamon couldn't begin to comprehend. She looked at him, at the wide, searching eyes of the man she had buried in her mind but never her heart. The world doesn't work on silver anymore, Eamon. And it doesn't work for ghosts. I have nowhere to go, Thera, he said, his voice finally breaking, the rigid posture of a major cracking under the weight of the neon-lit night. Thera looked at Lowell, who was already holding the car door open for the stranger. She knew the danger. She knew Vance was coming. But she looked at the man from the photograph and couldn't leave him in the rain. Get in, she said. We're going home. The front door of the farmhouse creaked open, admitting a gust of rain and a man who was a living contradiction to the passage of time. Eamon stepped into the entryway, his boots thudding softly on a rug that felt too plush, too modern. The air in the house didn't smell of the wood smoke and lavender he remembered. It smelled of vanilla candles and the sterile electric scent of a home filled with gadgets he didn't understand. Eamon, just wait here for a second, Thera whispered, her voice tight with an apprehension he was beginning to share. But the soldier was already moving. His eyes, trained to scan horizons for enemy movement, were drawn to the long hallway wall. It was a gallery of lives lived in the sunshine he had never seen. He walked toward it, his hand instinctively reaching out to touch the frames. The first photo was a wedding portrait. It wasn't the one of him and Thera in 1960. This was color, vibrant, terrifyingly sharp color. Thera stood in a white lace dress, looking older, her smile tinged with a peacefulness he hadn't been the one to give her. Standing beside her was a man with graying temples and a kind, solid face, a man who looked like he belonged in this world of paved roads and glowing bricks. Next to it were the milestones of a stranger's life. Thera pregnant, leaning against a tree. Thera holding a newborn Lowell in a hospital room filled with plastic monitors. There were photos of the three of them at the beach, at a baseball game, at a Christmas dinner where a golden turkey sat at the center of the table. In every shot, the other man was there. He was the one who had held her through the grief of Eamon's disappearance. He was the one who had taught Lowell how to ride a bike and how to tie his shoes. Eamon felt a hollow, clumsy sensation in his chest, as if he were a giant trying to walk through a glass house. He looked down at his own hands, scarred, youthful, and still stained with the grease of a 1962 engine. He realized with a violent, internal jolt that he wasn't a returning hero. He was a glitch in the system. Who is he? Eamon asked, his voice barely a tremor. His name was David, Thera said, standing in the shadows of the kitchen doorway. He passed away 3 years ago, Eamon. He was the man who stayed. Eamon turned back to the wall, his gaze landing on a small, dusty frame tucked in the corner. It was his own face, the black and white photo from the airfield. He looked so small compared to the life that had happened after he left. He wasn't the master of this house. He was an intruder in a sanctuary built on the foundations of his own death. He looked at Lowell, who was watching him from the sofa, and for the first time, Eamon didn't see a son to be reclaimed. He saw a boy who belonged to a dead man he could never defeat. The stillness of the farmhouse was shattered not by a sound, but by a physical rejection of reality. It started as a low-frequency hum that rattled the silverware against the ceramic plates in the kitchen. Then, the floorboards beneath Eamon's boots began to shudder, a rhythmic, deep-seated tremor that made the framed memories on the wall tilt and clatter. What is that? An earthquake? Lowell asked, his voice climbing an octave as he gripped the arm of the sofa. No, Eamon whispered, his pilot's instinct sensing the atmospheric pressure change. It's the rift. It's following me. Outside, the darkness was sliced open by the clinical glare of high-intensity floodlights. A fleet of black SUVs tore across the gravel driveway, stopping with a synchronized hiss of brakes. Agent Vance stepped out of the lead vehicle, his silhouette sharp against the artificial noon of the searchlights. He wasn't wearing a uniform, just a gray suit that looked as ironclad as his expression. In his hand, he held a handheld sensor that was chirping in a frantic, unbroken scream. He didn't knock. He stood on the porch, his voice amplified by a megaphone that turned his words into an inescapable decree. Major Caldwell. My name is Agent Vance. Every second you spend in this house, You are increasing the local temporal decay. Look at the ground, Major. You're a biological anomaly, and the Earth can't reconcile your mass with this century. As if on cue, a spiderweb crack snaked across the living room ceiling. The vibrations intensified, a seismic disturbance that felt like the house was being ground between two tectonic plates. Thera rushed to the window, pulling back the curtain to see the perimeter of armed men in tactical gear. "You have to leave," she gasped, looking at Eamon with a mixture of terror and heartbreak. "They're going to tear this place down to get to you." Vance's voice boomed again, cold and devoid of empathy. "The radiation on your flight suit is a beacon, Eamon. We tracked the exotic particles from the hospital to this coordinate. You are a walking earthquake. If you stay, this house collapses. If you stay, the boy is in danger. Come out with your hands visible, or we initiate a hard extraction." Eamon looked at the cracks in the walls, then at the terrified face of the son who wasn't his. The clumsy realization of the previous hour crystallized into a cold, hard mission. He wasn't just an intruder. He was a ticking bomb. The rigid posture of the soldier returned, his jaw tightening as he looked at the door. He wasn't surrendering to the men outside. He was surrendering to the truth that his presence was a poison to the people he loved. "Stay in the kitchen," Eamon commanded Thera, his voice regaining its command deck authority. "Don't let them see Lowell." He turned toward the door, the floor shaking violently beneath him, as the man from 1962 prepared to face the cold light of the future. The house continued to groan under the weight of an impossible physics, but Lowell wasn't looking at the cracks in the plaster. He was hunched over the kitchen island, his small fingers flying across the screen of the glowing tablet. The blue light washed over his face, making him look like a ghost of the future. While Eamon stood by the window, watching the silhouettes of Vance's men settle into a tactical formation, the boy let out a sharp, jagged gasp. "I found it," Lowell whispered. The Dayton Daily News. October 1962. Eamon turned away from the floodlights, his boots crunching on a fallen piece of ceiling crown molding. He walked to the island, peering down at the screen. The text was sharp, the digital archive of a world that had moved on without him. There was a grainy photo of his starfighter, and beneath it, a headline that felt like a physical blow. Local pilot declared dead after catastrophic mid-air disappearance. "Read it," Eamon commanded, his voice a hollow echo. Lowell swallowed hard, his voice trembling as he scrolled through the text. It says Major Eamon Caldwell's plane was found weeks later in the Burma Mountains. But it wasn't a crash from the war. It says the pilot was found inside the cockpit, but he wasn't killed by the enemy. He was shot by unidentified high-tech pursuit forces while trying to take off into a storm. The room went cold. Eamon felt the floor beneath him tilt, but it wasn't the seismic tremors this time. It was the crushing weight of a closed loop. He looked at the date of the recovery. It matched the historical records of the very mission he was flying when he hit the rift. "Don't you see, Eamon?" Thera said from the shadows, her eyes brimming with a terrifying clarity. "You didn't die because of the rift. You died because you tried to come back. The unidentified forces, they aren't from 1962. They're Vance. They're the agency." The clumsy realization of his existence finally shattered. His survival here, in this bright and terrifying future, was the very thing that ensured his death in the past. If he stayed, the world would break around him. If he fled back to his own time, Vance's men would be waiting in the shadows of history to finish what they started tonight. His survival wasn't a miracle. It was a predestined execution. Eamon looked at the tablet, then at Lowell, whose existence was the only beautiful thing to come out of this tragedy. He realized that every moment he spent breathing 21st century air, he was stealing time from the woman he loved and the son he never knew. The mission wasn't to stay. The mission was to close the circle. The tremors had reached a fever pitch, rattling the glass in the window frames until it sang a high, discordant note of impending structural failure. Outside, the agency's floodlights flickered in rhythm with the seismic groans of the earth, a strobe effect that made the approaching tactical teams look like stuttering ghosts. Eamon turned away from the window, his gaze landing on Thera. She stood in the center of the kitchen, her silhouette framed by the artifacts of a life he hadn't built. The air between them was thick with the scent of ozone and 30 years of unspoken goodbyes. "I can't stay, can I?" Eamon asked, his voice barely audible over the grinding of the foundation. Thera shook her head, tears tracing paths through the dust on her cheeks. "The world is literally rejecting you, Eamon. Every minute you're here, you're tearing the fabric of Lowell's life apart." She stepped closer, her hands hovering near his chest but never touching, as if afraid the contact would shatter them both. "I love you. I never stopped. But I'm not that girl on the tarmac anymore. I'm a mother, and I'm a survivor. I belong to this time, to this house, and to the man who helped me raise our—" She stopped, her eyes darting to Lowell. Eamon looked at the boy. Lowell was standing by the back door, clutching the tablet like a shield, his eyes wide with a mixture of terror and a profound, heartbreaking recognition. In that moment, Eamon didn't see a stranger. He saw the living proof that his life in 1962 had mattered. Lowell was the continuation of his story, the legacy he had sent forward through time. If Eamon stayed, the seismic disturbances would eventually bring the roof down on the boy's head. "He needs a world that stays still," Eamon said, the realization settling over him like a heavy shroud. "He needs a father who is a hero in a story, not a ghost who brings the walls down." The back door suddenly burst open, and the cold night air rushed in, smelling of rain and jet fuel. Agent Vance stood on the threshold, his handheld scanner glowing a violent, pulsated red. "The window is closing, Major. The rift is peeking back at the crash site. If you don't go now, the collapse becomes permanent." Eamon looked at Thera one last time, memorizing the way the modern light caught the gray in her hair. He reached out and squeezed Lowell's hand. Not the grip of a soldier, but the steadying touch of a man who had finally found his mission. "Take care of her," Eamon whispered to the boy. He didn't look back as he stepped out into the blinding glare of the floodlights. He was no longer an intruder or a victim of fate. He was a pilot with a target, and for the first time since he had fallen from the sky, Eamon Caldwell knew exactly where he was supposed to be. The clearing at the creek bed was a cathedral of electric blue light and churning fog. The agency's technicians had cleared the area, leaving only the silver Lockheed Starfighter, its fuselage humming with a sympathetic vibration to the rift opening above. The air felt thin, vibrating with a high-pitched metallic shriek that signaled the closing of the door between worlds. Eamon stood at the edge of the water, the wind from the atmospheric disturbance whipping his flight jacket. Thera and Lowell stood just beyond the perimeter, their faces pale under the strobe effect of the temporal eye. Vance watched from the distance, a silent sentinel ensuring the anomaly was resolved. Eamon turned to the boy. Lowell's eyes were glassy, his small frame trembling from the cold and the sheer impossible weight of the moment. Without a word, Eamon reached for the silver wings pinned to his chest. They were tarnished, heavy with the history of a decade that was about to reclaim him. He pressed the metal into Lowell's palm, his hand steadying the boy's. "Carry these," Eamon said, his voice cutting through the roar of the wind. "They don't belong to a ghost. They belong to the son of a man who loved you enough to leave." Lowell gripped the wings, a single nod of understanding passing between them. Eamon looked at Thera, the woman who had been his bride, his widow, and finally, his savior. He didn't say goodbye. He simply climbed the ladder into the cockpit, the familiar scent of oil and oxygen mask rubber welcoming him home like a cold embrace. The canopy slid shut with a mechanical hiss, sealing him into the 1960s. He engaged the thrusters, the engine's roar drowning out the 21st century. As the jet lifted from the mud, Eamon saw the rift through the HUD, a swirling vortex of white fire and jagged memories. He knew what waited on the other side. He knew Vance's predecessors would be in the Burmese sky, waiting to complete the obituary Lowell had read. He knew he was flying toward his end. But as he banked the ship and throttled forward into the heart of the storm, Eamon felt a profound, surging peace. He wasn't a man who had lost his life. He was a man who had ensured one. The timeline would remain intact. Thera would keep her home. Lowell would grow up in a world of glowing bricks and safe streets, carrying a piece of the father who had survived history just long enough to say goodbye. The starfighter vanished into the light, leaving only the smell of ozone and the quiet rustle of the Ohio oaks. On the ground, Lowell opened his hand to see the silver wings gleaming, a permanent anchor in a world that finally stood still.